I was only 7 years old when I first saw this image. I was reading Halliwell's film guide and opened a page at random. I came face to face with a picture of the creature from the Black Lagoon. To my young innocent brain, it was as if this creature reached through the page, its gilled hands ready to rip my face off. The creature terrified me. It was love at first sight. My parents encouraged this new love of all things that go boo in the night. Other adults didn't see it that way. They told me I'd grow out of my fascination for horror cinema. They were wrong. Because horror is not child's play.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
I recognized even at this young age that horror was deep and cultural. It was more than monsters, more than boo scares, more than just the genre of fright. Horror, I realized, was a way to understand humans, to understand society. Horror cinema reflected us. So to paraphrase Nietzsche's saying about looking into the abyss, let's say that if we look at horror films, then horror films look back at us. Hello, my name is Wolfcraft. I am a filmmaker and novelist, and I really love genre fiction. This is me as a kid unwrapping birthday presents. Classic horror films were harder to find back in Norway in the early 1990s. My father had returned from a business trip and he had gotten me several VHS tapes of rare films for my birthday. The best one, which he saved for last, was Creature from the Black Lagoon, ending a 4-year quest to see the film. But the creature was only the tip of the iceberg, so I began hunting down horror films on my own, trying to get my chubby little fingers on any fright film I could find. For me, genre films were the best, most fun, and most thought-provoking. If you're watching this video essay, I gather you feel likewise, or at least you're interested in horror cinema. As you should be. But what exactly is a horror film? The Wikipedia definition of horror cinema is simply this. A horror film is a movie that seeks to elicit a psychological reaction, such as elevated heartbeat, through the use of fear, or shocking one's audience. Yeah, as a definition, that works. A bit clinical perhaps, but a pretty straightforward rundown of what horror films are. But horror is also much more. Like any art form worth its salt, it isn't just about what we see on the surface. So let's go deeper.
Where are those keys, Rose?
I love horror because it makes audiences think. I love horror because it makes us feel.
I am ordering you to turn around!
I love horror because it makes us laugh. I love horror because it mirrors society. And of course, I love horror because it scares me. This moment terrified me as a kid. For as long as I can remember, I've had a phobia about paintings and pictures coming alive. This is a primal fear, the idea of being watched, as prey. Some monster is lurking, eyes watching me, ready to pounce and make a meal of me. Growing up as a chubby kid, I knew if there actually was a monster, I was going to get eaten first.
Please stroll on the moors. Tra-la-la-la-la.
So I would like to add to the Wikipedia definition. Horror films are about the human condition.
It's in front of us.
And boy are we humans afraid of stuff.
Oh shit, what is it?
Fear is a huge part of our reality. From the fear of terrorism.
This is amateur.
Fear of losing our jobs.
Can I ask you something, Mr. Lockhart?
Fear of bullying.
Ever have a 12-inch black dick in your ass?
Fear of rejection.
You saying that I got a big head? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know, fear of pigeons.
Here to amuse you?
If there is something we can all agree on, it is that we humans go through life afraid. And to deal with that fear, we have horror films.
Oh, just some scary movie.
Watching others be terrified and joining them in their fear is the greatest possible release mechanism we have. And it makes the horror genre important. Far more important than critics and academics often acknowledge. In fact, as long as I can remember, people have talked horror down, thinking it less serious than dramas and, I don't know, French New Wave or something. So the best defense of horror as a genre is to look at the films, and to ask what they meant historically and societally when they were initially released. With History of Horror, I want to explore many different facets of horror cinema.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance,
why did we have self-aware horror films like Scream in the 1990s? Or what was horror like during World War II? And was there a direct link between the horrors of war and what we saw on screen? I will analyze specific films, trying to get an idea of how past audiences saw them, versus how they are viewed today. Sometimes, the series will simply be about amusing trends and why they failed or succeeded, or why horror films are awesome. So, what is horror? Going back to Wikipedia definition, it talked about horror films eliciting an elevated heartbeat. True, but so do thrillers. And romantic films. Okay, so what about horror films shocking its audience?
hello!
They certainly employ shock effects vigorously and often. But the same can be said for other types of films. Comedy shocks audiences with the unexpected.
What is it? Don't ask.
Technically, comedy is about surprise. Just like a good horror film, a good comedy subverts audience expectation. Except the goal is laughter, not fright. Then again, people tend to laugh after a particularly good shock effect. Comedy and horror are linked, because they both work on an emotional release. You could make similar arguments for drama and action as well. Another common definition is that horror films are dark, nihilistic, and bleak. I'm not sure I agree. Don't get me wrong, many horror films are bleak as all hell, but many are not. For instance, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein isn't a negative film, but it certainly belongs in the horror genre. Yes, it is more comedy than horror, but it deals with fear, and obviously with monsters. But in this case, the film is much more focused on scaring poor Lou Costello, rather than scaring the audience. Costello then becomes an avatar through which we can experience the fear without actually being afraid ourselves. It is simply a different way to deal with the emotion, and a rather pleasant one at that. Then take Poltergeist. That is definitely a horror film. But the ending isn't downbeat. In fact, spoiler alert, it ends on a humorous note, with no casualties in the family. And all in all, the film mixes its sense of horror with a sense of wonder. Sure, there is fear, but there's also a sense of adventure. We come out of that film feeling good and thrilled, rather than having a so-called negative emotional reaction.
Diane, the determination as to whether your home is haunted is not very easy.
She's my sister. She's my daughter.
If a negative emotional reaction is the main point of the horror genre, then technically a film like Chinatown is also horror.
She's my sister and my daughter.
Because it has a goddamn bleak ending. But of course, Chinatown isn't horror.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
Neither are these two films, somehow included in the Academy Awards' long overdue tribute to the genre. Sure, crazed Nazi in hiding dentists are scary, but The Marathon Man is a thriller, not horror. And yeah, society tells young women that they should be afraid of sex, but that doesn't make Twilight a horror film. Neither do vampires, werewolves, and other supernatural events. They are more fantasy than horror, and romantic fantasy at that. So what makes a film a member of the horror genre? Is Psycho a thriller or a horror film? What about Pan's Labyrinth? Is that fantasy or horror? And Alien? Well, is that science fiction or horror? I think the answers to these questions are subjective, and thus hard to answer in the introductory episode of this series. But don't worry, we'll get to it. In the meantime, let me just leave you with this. Horror is fluid and diverse. It covers a wide spectrum of human experience, and historical context absolutely matters. If made today, King Kong would fall into the adventure fantasy genre. The remakes and spin-offs certainly belong in the adventure fantasy realm, and not under the horror label. But when King Kong first appeared in 1933, the film was absolutely considered horror. It remains a classic of the genre. This gives us a fairly liberal definition of horror as a genre. I like it that way. Horror is bigger than most audiences realize. The genre doesn't just include films with shock effects, but also include films that deal with state of mind and existential terror. The horror genre has, in my opinion, some of the most fertile ground for studying cinema history, because it existed on the fringes. Because it existed in mainstream Hollywood. Because it was schlock. Because it was high art.
Well, you better let the poor guy out!
And because it was everything in between. So, in this video essay series, let's explore that history, and the films, and the people who made them, and how the films affected the world at large. Welcome to the history of horror.
God help us.
My name is Wolfcraft. I hope you have enjoyed this History of Horror episode. Join me next time for History of Horror episode 2, Dracula, A Man for All Ages. And if you enjoyed this, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thanks a plenty!